Well, I think it's a geological reality. There's only a certain amount of oil that we'll be able to extract. That's a limited resource, limited 90 to 150 million years ago. And peak oil is the moment in which we get halfway through what we can extract. It's not that oil's going to run out, but that inexorably after that date you're on a downward curve where there's less available. And I suppose in a world where demand is increasing almost at the moment by 2 million barrels a day per year, how do you deal with the situation where there's something like a 2 million barrels a day reduction each year available? Now there'll be other resources that are available, heavy tars and other kind of polar and other ice cap oil and gas that could be liquidized, but the reality is it takes a lot of energy to do that, and the overall energy equation would be there'd be less easy oil available to us, or less easy energy, and oil was about the best energy resource we'll ever have. Transportable, storable, energy dense, solar energy stored for 100 million years. The challenge or the difficulty is that our economy, our agricultural system, our transport system, our heating systems have built around that cheap, easy availability of energy, and it's not going to be as easily or cheaply available. I think it's becoming increasingly more recognised, and even at an official level, if you look at the International Energy Agency, which represents the large OECD countries, their analysis would have changed quite dramatically in recent years from one of quite scepticism about the concept of peak oil to one actually pretty much of acceptance of it. Not maybe defining the exact year, but the concept in terms of the difficulties and the challenges it presents. So it's more widely accepted now than it was 5 years ago, much more widely. It's still a difficult issue, I think, for politicians or for industry leaders. Maybe I think increased largely because in the sense there that maybe people have heard the same story before, that a lot of people of a certain age, anyone over 40, would remember the 1970s and similar kind of prognosis, and that didn't arrive maybe in the time that some people expected it would have. And that, I think, tempers people's reaction or understanding of this issue. They kind of maybe think, oh, well, it wasn't true then in my experience of the last 20, 30 years, maybe it won't be true now. And I think that's probably one of the biggest blocks. It may not be, energy security is not high profile in the public, but actually I think among policymakers it does actually have a very high profile. If you look at all the recent G8 meetings, if you look at the high level European Union, Russia meetings, if you look at the kind of what actually happens at high level and global political level, they spend a lot of time talking about energy security. A lot of our geopolitical activity, I think there's a recognition it's around energy security issues. So I think at a very political level it's actually probably higher up the agenda in many instances. The public less so, and I suppose maybe there needs to be a story told, which is a difficult one, that these two issues are connected. In a sense, solving one helps solve the other. They're not competing. There certainly isn't a sense that climate change will be, in my mind, solved by oil running out, and that therefore there'll be less emissions. The reality is we've more than enough gas, coal, and other fossil fuels left to actually tip us beyond the tipping points in climate change. But so peak oil, I think what it does is it gives us a huge economic imperative to address our fossil fuel use, to cut back our emissions. And that backs up the moral imperative in climate change to do the same thing. I think there's a real case to be made for kind of joining constituencies together. Various constituencies have an interest in this area to try and achieve the same end goal, which is less use of fossil fuels, less emissions, less dependence on imported oil. I'm recently appointed as Minister for Energy in the Irish Government. I have that daunting sense of realisation of the scale of the challenge we face. We need to cut our use of emissions by something like 3% per annum, at the very least, if we're to achieve the kind of climate change targets we need to meet. The reality is our emissions are growing at 3% per year. Our use of energy is growing at 3% per annum. So going from that increase to decrease is a real difficulty. And particularly on a couple of areas like transport, where it's growing even faster. Our use of oil is going up to about 8% per annum. And I suppose the challenge we have is making sort of long-term investment decisions now. They're going to switch that we need to start, in my mind, building kind of increased emphasis on public transport and better planning, so we reduce the kind of travel distances people have to make. And that for Ireland is probably the biggest challenge. There are other areas where there's, I mean, if you look at our emissions and where our use of oil is undertaken, we also have opportunities. I mean, we have huge renewable resources here. We have huge wind resources, wave, tidal, other resources we could develop. It's a great growing country. You can grow biomass crops here very quickly. So one of the ways I think I put the message is that this has a challenge to the Irish people, but it's also an opportunity that we can develop some of those natural resources which cut our emissions, cut back our import bill. And then the last one, I suppose, the last big area, if you look at where we're using oil and where there are emissions, is in the agriculture area, and that's a difficult one. That's probably kind of slower, more long-term. But that might also be helped because farmers, as I said, moving towards energy crops, biomass crops, or local kind of provision of local energy services. So it's both a challenge and an opportunity. I probably do both. I think the concept of a carbon levy, a carbon tax, particularly in Ireland, like Ireland, where you can just measure the oil tanker coming in to this Cork harbour. You know exactly how much carbon's on board, so you can apply it very easily, and then it can trickle through the market. The difficulty is to get it to sort of levels that are going to have a real effect in terms of the level of behaviour change we want. It's going to be very difficult politically, and that's why I suppose I also see the merit and the benefit in going towards a rationing or an allocation system, particularly if it's within, or what are already developing allocation systems, or which could be set up under an international climate change agreement, because I think that would have the advantage that it would be in common with other countries. It would be for a clearly defined purpose in terms of meeting the greatest challenge we've ever faced, and that would bring in public acceptance and also still allow certain freedom for people to decide themselves as to how they cut their energy use, how they get their new energy supplies in. So I would imagine the first one will be a certain amount of taxation, and then it'll switch towards a ration and an allocation system. And I think it's interesting to look at the UK. Their own carbon budget is kind of investigating the carbon allocation systems. We're setting up a similar carbon budget this year, and I think that will evolve from firstly an initial kind of analysis of what we're doing on energy, involve our engagement in things like the European emissions trading system, but I would hope and I would be pushing for an evolution towards a more innovative schemes which leaves people free to how they solve the problem, and at the same time orders the retreat which we need to make from our use of fossil fuels. It's probably inertia in the system. I think we've had 120 years of an oil-based system, which everyone has, or not everyone, but there's 150 years of developing a supply chain for oil gas-fired heaters, for internal combustion engine in the car. There's a inertia that comes with that 120 years of development in a certain direction. I think renewables are going to be important. I would have to say, I think probably energy efficiency, the demand side, is probably going to be more important immediately. I mean, there's no point us trying to run a bath and leave the plug out. You've got to hold the energy that you're using, or the energy services, as efficiently as possible. And often it's going to be some of the less sexy areas or the less high-profile areas that maybe the areas you can make the first great gains. I always say it's difficult when you're campaigning on either of these issues. You might kind of go down a street with a chant, what do we want? Better insulation, when do we want it now? It's not exactly a revolutionary call, but it's pretty much the nature of the sort of first changes we need to make to cut back our wasteful use of energy, to change our travel patterns, to start switching things off. No one of those is hugely dramatic on its own, but that's the way we need to go. There's a moral issue here. I was at a climate change conference recently, and a philosopher posed the issue. Let's say if you're robbing a bank, and someone else is robbing the bank. You can't morally say, I'm not going to stop robbing the bank because someone else is robbing the bank. It's either right or wrong. And if what we're doing in emitting such fossil fuels is actually threatening the lives of people and the rest of the planet, then it behoves us to stop, regardless of what other people are doing. I suppose the second sense is there's also recognition that Ireland is very much an open, small trading economy. Most of the goods we have are probably made, or a lot of them are made in China. Our waste materials are going to China. A lot of the energy they're using are actually processing the global trading system that we're all part of. So no one is separate. No one is independent of this. Everyone has responsibility, and we can't just take responsibility by saying, "I'll wait till someone else does it." I think it needs it. I think it's happening that the European Union has led, and I'm confident, because of the scale of the challenge, the certainty of the challenge ahead of us, of the threat that's presented, that we will get international cooperation, and that we will pull China and India and America in. And I think that benefits from the European Union and other countries individually taking it on. I think I was saying at the start of my own speech that I would hope it will kickstart a whole policy development recognition of the issue here. It's already here. I mean, we benefit from having people like Colin Campbell living in Ireland who are fairly readily accessible. So a lot of that analysis is in the public sphere. It's going from the analysis of the problem to actually doing something about it is the real leap. And I think a conference the like of which we had today is a key step in that direction. And I suppose as in a government as well, it is recognition at the start of a 5-year term in government that it's a marker that we start today and every day in government, every day in work. Your main job is to try and protect the Irish people, protect their interests by actually cutting back our use of these resources.